Hello students, today we are going to look into theories of emotion. So let's start with the theories first. So there are 5 major theories when it comes to emotion. Tannenberg Theory, JamesLange Theory, Shasta and Singer Theory, Facial Feedback Theory and Lazarus Cognitive Theory. So we look into each and every theory in detail. First will be Tannenberg Theory. So he told that emotion as well as the physiological change will happen simultaneously in a person. So when an emotion provoking event occurs, it will induce the physiological changes as well as the experience or as well as the subjective experience of emotion simultaneously. So the autonomic nervous system and the cerebral cortex of a person will work together, which will make the person to experience that particular emotion. So bodily changes and emotion will happen at the same time. So this is the demonstration of Tannenberg theory. If there's a stimulus or emotion arousing event, it will cause the emotion as well as physiological change together simultaneously. A person can experience the conscious awareness of emotion and the physiological changes at the same time. That is what his theory is about. The next one will be JamesLange Theory. So according to him, what he told was, when an external stimulus or when a emotion provoking stimulus is induced or is met, the person's physiological reaction starts to begin. The physiological reaction can be palpitation, sweating, increased heart rate, trembling, anything. So after experiencing the physiological change, the body will interpret or the brain will interpret this physiological change to be a particular emotion. For example, if you see a danger or if you see any wild animal, your body will first experience the change that you are in approach to a emotional provoking situation. So your body is going to experience that change, after which this bodily changes gives information to your brain, and that information will be interpreted into a particular emotion. So there's a danger, your body has certain change which will make you realize that it is a emotion, it is fear or anything that you have to react. So first, it can be explained with this: there will be a stimulus which will have a bodily change from which you will experience a emotion. The next theory is Shastra and Singer's theory. It is also called two-factor theory. It is called two-factor theory because in this theory, the cognitive aspect also comes into considerations, which means a person's arousal or physiological changes happens with respect to the cognitive interpretation as well. So a physiological arousal, after seeking a stimulus, the bodily reaction happens, and then the individual will identify the reason why is there's a change in my physiological self. And after having a cognitive interpretation, then the person will experience a particular emotion. So when a person is in contact with the emotion provoking situation, there will be a physiological change, and the person will analyze the environmental in what context and try to interpret the context, and then the emotion happens. So there's an event which is going to create a arousal or physiological change, from which the brain or the cognitive reasoning part is going to interpret the reason behind this change, which will in return will identify that there is a particular emotion or there is a change in that particular person. The next theory is facial feedback theory. In this theory, they talk about emotion in relation to facial expression. So when there is a emotion, when there is a emotional provoking situation or a stimulus, it will have a change in the physiological self, or it will the stimulus will produce a bodily response or physiological change which will have a reaction or which will have an effect on the facial expression, and based on this facial expression the emotion is identified. For example, if a person is in a social gathering, so that is a stimulus. Once the person is getting into that particular social gathering, there will be a bodily response. The person can become you know more you know very happy about meeting others, or it can be in a negative way where the person doesn't like to be in that particular situation. So if a person is very happy to be in that particular place, if the person it or any negative reaction also, it creates a kind of body change which will be shown as a facial expression. So the person can greet with a smile, or the person can frown. So based on the facial expression, the person can be judged to be happy or interpreted to be happy or sad. So yeah, so facial expression are connected to particular emotion, and facial feedback theory says that emotions are directly tied with facial muscle. Not only of facial expression, even body posture, voice tone can also influence the emotion of a person. So facial expression can sometimes have an impact of emotion. So that is what this theory is about. The next theory and the last theory will be Lazarus cognitive mediational theory. This is also a theory which incorporates the cognitive aspect, the thinking aspect in emotion. So this theory explains about the relationship between cognition and emotion. In this theory, they focus on something called appraisal. Appraisal is nothing but an automatic tendency of an individual to interpret a particular situation. So it is a cognitive process, it is an automatic cognitive process where the person tries to interpret a particular environment the person is in, and this interpretation is subjective to that person also. So that is called appraisal. And in this theory, what they say is, a person, when the person is introduced to a particular stimuli which is emotion provoking, then that particular stimuli leads to the cognitive properties. It will increase the cognitive processing capacity of the individual. After analyzing, or after the cognitive process happens, then it will lead to the arousal from which the emotion is detected. That is the link. Here the cognitive property comes into place, which will help to understand the arousal, or which will help to understand the bodily change and why this kind of emotion is happening in that particular person. So cognitive appraisal um, will give a clear understanding of a person's emotion. And this is the explanation where the stimulus first, if there's a stimulus, it will lead to a appraisal, that is cognitive processing. The person starts to think what is exactly happening in that particular situation. After analyzing the situation, after cognitively processing the situation, after getting all the information and interpreting the situation, then the person will understand that something is happening, and this is the emotion which I am going to face, and that will give a particular response in the person. So in this, see, the animal is a stimulus where the person is going to analyze that particular situation, whether the person is going to be attacked or not, whether this animal is dangerous or not, whether that situation is dangerous for that person or not. After analyzing the whole criteria or the whole situation, then it will lead to a particular emotion, which is fear in this case, and that fear will give a response, and this response can be flight or fight response. So that's what this theory explains. This is the comparison of all the theories. In this comparison, we won't have facial feedback theory. I'll just summarize about all the theories. First theory which we saw was, I think, Tannenberg theory, where there's a stimulus, the physiological and emotion part works simultaneously in a person. So simultaneous reaction or simultaneous reaction of your physiological aspect and your neural brain activity is what Tannenberg theory is about. So your physiology and your emotion works together at the same time. Next one will be JamesLange theory, where there is a stimuli which leads to a physiological change, and that physiological change will be interpreted as a emotion. So here the stimulus is snake, the physiological change is increased heart rate and sweating. That is interpreted as the emotion fear. The next will be Shasta and Singer two-factor theory. In this is the first theory where we will see about the cognitive aspect. So there's a stimuli, there's arousal, which will lead to the physiological aspect and a cognitive reasoning. Both will act together and will be interpreting a particular emotion. So the snake is the stimulus which will have a physiological change, that is increased heart rate and sweating, and cognitive reasoning happens, which together will lead to fear, which is a emotion that is being interpreted. Last one is Lazarus cognitive theory, where there's a stimulus, cognition happens, then comes the emotional part, and then the bodily reaction. That is the difference. First there's a stimulus, then you will interpret and analyze, that is the cognitive part, and after that you will know what kind of emotion it is, fear, and then comes your bodily reaction. So for Shasta and Lazarus, the differentiation is, for Shasta, snake, physiological and cognition acts together, which will be interpreted as fear. For Lazarus, snake process the environment, process the cognitive, uh, process the situation cognitively, that is appraisal, which acts automatically. It is automatic process, which will lead to the emotion, that is fear, and then it leads to the bodily reaction, that is increased heart rate and sweating. So this is the overall comparisons between theories. Yeah, again, facial feedback theory is the stimulus, bodily reaction, which will be expressed in your face in a form of your expression. That is facial feedback theory. The next, so this is what about theories of emotion. So these are the 5 important theories where you have to how an individual is interpreting emotion. Next one will be assessment of emotion. Emotion can be assessed in 3 aspects. First one is self-report, where the person himself will say what kind of emotion he is going through, what is his current feeling, what he is actually experiencing now. The person can explain about his emotion, that is self-report. Second one is behavioral observation, where we will be able to observe people's emotion from their behavior in a particular context. That is behavioral observation. Where we need to study a person's emotion, we will try to observe the person in a particular situation and we will infer the information. The last way is physiological measure. So physiological measure is measuring the activity of autonomic nervous system and sympathetic nervous system to know about the person's emotional state. So the activity of these two nervous system will give information about the person's current emotional state. So for this PET, position emission tomography, and fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, these two brain scans can be used to detect the brain activity of a person. Yeah. So yeah, that's all for today's topic, and we have covered the whole emotion topic. On the other day I spoke about the basics of emotion, where we discussed about what is emotion and the three important elements or three important components of emotion. And today we have discussed about 5 theories of emotion and how do you assess emotion. And when assessing emotion, there are many scales and many questionnaires are used, or also used to assess emotion, where you can also add on to this topic, assessment of emotion. Thank you.